Dear students, welcome to this lecture. In today's lecture, we will be discussing the concept of nation and nationalism and different versions of nationalism that we find in the contemporary South Asia. The lecture will comprise of following sections. First, we will be discussing in detail the theoretical concept of nation and nationalism. Secondly, we will be familiarizing ourselves with nationalism in the South Asian context and how it is different from the European experience. Third, we will briefly refresh ourselves with famous Gandhi-Tagore debate on nationalism. And at last, we will be looking at various versions of nationalism in modern nation states of South Asia by looking at India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal and Bhutan. So let's have a look on the conceptual debate on nation and nationalism. Whether one believes that nationalism creates the idea of nations or that nation develops the ideas related to nationalism, one cannot discuss nationalism without considering what one means by nation. According to Anthony Smith, nation is a named human population sharing a historic territory, common myths and historical memories, a mass public culture, a common economy, and common legal rights and duties for all members. While criticizing this definition of Smith, L08 is of the view that Smith has mixed together the reasons for the emergence of nation, such as historic territory and common economy, with the results such as sharing myths and historical memories. For L08, a nation is a community whose members share feeling of fraternity, substantial distinctiveness, as well as beliefs in a common ancestry and continuous genealogy. Both Smith and Thamer have developed on cultural features. The importance of the belief in territorial self-determination for a group is central part of most of the definitions of nation in the nationalism literature, and it provides an important criteria for differentiating between nation and other social categories. As Gihanoya puts it, a nation is a community of people organized around the idea of self-determination. The idea of self-determination has been understood in most of the literature as a control over the state. Another scholar, Ernest Haas, proposes that nation is a socially mobilized body of individuals believing themselves to be united by some set of characteristics that differentiate them from outsiders, striving to create or maintain their own state. While some scholars do not agree that nation must pursue its own state, the idea of territory is crucial to understand the national identity. So the common threads that are found in the nationalism literature while defining the nation are, first and foremost, nation is a collective of people. Secondly, what makes nation different from other social groups is their shared cultural features and belief in the right to territorial self-determination. Thus, nations are groups of people linked by unifying traits and the desire to control a territory that is thought of group's homeland. The belief in the right to territorial control is central to distinguishing nations from other collectives. Thus, the nations are not just unified by culture, they are unified by a sense of purpose, controlling the territory that the members of group believe to be theirs. Now, let's have a look on the concept of nationalism. One set of approach to the definition of nationalism considers it to be an idea, belief or principle. Michael Ignatieff sees the nationalism as a nation that combines the political idea of territorial self-determination, the cultural idea of nation as one's primary identity, and a moral idea of justification of action to protect rights of nation against other. In line to this, Gellner also had defined nationalism as a principle which holds that the political and national unit should be congruent. If we look at the Ernest Haas, he even goes to more basics and defines nationalism as a belief held by a group of people that they ought to constitute a nation or that they already are one. While taking the strongest stand in defining nationalism, Alexander Motyl argues that because nationalism is based on ideas such as nation-state, self-determination, national identity, and national superiority, actions based on these ideas cannot be basis for the definition of nationalism, unless we make the absurd assumption that beliefs invariably translate automatically into behavior. Thus, one does not have to make an absurd assumption to include activities in the definition of a concept that also has important ideas at its core. The idea of national rights should not be thought of as nationalism without at least the open articulation of this idea to general population. A second more useful approach to defining nationalism takes it to be a process. It is thought of as the creation of unifying features of nation and the actions that result from the beliefs of the group. Nationalism, defined as an organized endeavor to control the national homeland, for example, is common in the nationalism literature. Some stress that this struggle must turn homeland into an independent nation state. Others would stop short of the requirement that the group even seeks its own state, thus accepting struggles for autonomy within existing state as nationalism. But most of scholars agree that the control over one's own nation state is a goal for most nationalists. Roy Miller's definition of nationalism as the political expression of the nation's aspiration, including control over territory that members of a nation pursue as their homeland by right, is therefore an improvement over the labeling of nationalism as simply an idea. It combines the ideas and activities of nationalists. Though there is a debate over the definition of nationalism, but two features which are shared by all are: first, that they define, at least roughly, the territorial boundaries that nation has a right to control, and second, they define the membership boundaries of population that makes up the nation, the group that deserves this territorial control and is entitled the supreme royalty of other members of the collective. These membership boundaries are set by members of nation themselves, generally by intellectual or political elite, though they may be biased on the ideas of surrounding groups as well. Dear students, we will briefly discuss now the experience of nationalism in South Asia and how it is different from that of Europe. It's clear from some of the above stated definitions that nationalism has been viewed in the Western world as a process through which an ethno-cultural identity moves towards self-determination. In Europe, nationalism took roots as a demand for self-determination since the late half of 18th century. It was cultural homogeneity and ethnic cohesion which formed the basis of organization of homogeneous cultural identities into an autonomous nation state. It was due to nationalism that many empires with heterogeneous cultural groups got disintegrated and new independent states emerged with homogeneous cultural identity. In this way, in European context, nationalism can be viewed as a process whose ultimate objective is to draw a distinction between the people on the basis of ethnocultural identity and then claims its sovereign rights over a particular territory. A large number of factors have contributed to the growth of nationalism in South Asia. The historical events, symbols, traditions, etc. have played a significant role in uniting the people into a single national entity. The colonial rule and the quest for independence and self-rule have been important sources of growth of nationalism in South Asia. In fact, the ideology of nationalism was articulated in these countries in the wake of struggle for independence. The basic objective of this struggle was to overthrow the colonial rule and establish self-rule. Their nationalist ethos were represented by the indigenous elite, which tried to mobilize people against the alien rule. If we look at the experience of subcontinent, various factors such as modern education, means of communication, print capitalism, literary works in vernacular language led to the emergence and articulation of nationalism, which reflected as a resistance to the British colonial rule. What Anthony Smith puts forth as a feeling of us and them that could be seen emerging in many parts of British India, where people from different religions and languages started imagining themselves as one nation. Indian National Congress and its leaders became the spokesperson for the secular nationalism in the subcontinent, with emphasis on unity in diversity. Later, the Muslim League tried to narrow it down for articulating nationalism on the basis of religion by emphasizing on two-nation theory. Dear students, at this point, it's important to have a look on an interesting debate that took place between Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore on the question of nationalism. Apart from ideological debate between secular nationalism of Congress and Muslim nationalism of Muslim League, there were also normative debates over the notion of nationalism itself. The growth of extremist politics in subcontinent, as well as the violent form of nationalism in Europe that led to the First World War, made people apprehensive about the concept of nationalism. This normative debate of nationalism in South Asia can be better understood by the positions taken by two stalwarts of South Asia, Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. For Gandhi, any country to be designated as a nation, it must have the accommodating capacity, or say the people calling themselves as a nation should have the sense of being a community despite having differences amongst them as individuals. Here Gandhi seems to anticipate the essence of Benedict Anderson's celebrated theory of nation as an imagined communities. According to Gandhi, India has been a nation right from pre-British time, which is evident from two inherent attributes of Indian civilization. One is its accommodating capacity, and the other is the existence of certain places of pilgrimage scattered throughout India. Gandhi wished to develop an Indian kind of nationalism which would be far more accommodative and more rooted in Indian traditions and cultures rather than being influenced from the West. Gandhi, in this regard, openly condemned the extremists who were impressed by the violent tactics of the Italian nationalists like Garibaldi and Cavour in their project of nation building. On the other hand, Tagore was not antithetical to the idea of nation and nationalism from the beginning. In fact, Tagore had been a passionate supporter of nationalism during first decade of 20th century, and many people derived inspiration from him in this regard. Tagore's disillusionment with nationalism grew further in second decade of 20th century when the ugly face of nationalism revealed in Japan's deadly war of aggression against China, in Europe's march towards the global conflict of 1914 to 18, and in outbursts of revolutionary terrorism in India. From now on, Tagore turned into a strong critic of nationalism. He argued that nationalism was just another name for appropriation by brute force, if necessary, of the wealth and raw material of other countries, and that nationalism would ultimately breed isolationism and violate the highest ideals of humanity. Thus, while Tagore, considering imperialism as an external expression of nationalism, cherished the idea of internationalism by moving above the narrowness of the idea of nationalism. Gandhi, on the other hand, brought the idea of internationalism within the folds of nationalism, thereby broadening its horizon and making it more assimilative and tolerant. Dear students, now we will discuss the trends of nationalism in contemporary South Asia. As discussed already, nationalism in South Asia has been much different from nationalism which developed in Europe. Most of the scholars are of the opinion that here it began to take roots as an ideology of a struggle against the colonial rule. The leaders of independence movement in various parts of South Asia were inspired by Western democratic ideology and education. But the objective conditions on ground, which were different, shaped the discourse of nationalism here. The struggle for independence required support and involvement of different communities, regions, and groups. Thus, the struggle for independence provided a platform for the growth of secular nationalism, whose primary objective was to bind the people together, irrespective of caste, creed, ethnicity, language, and religion. Such a model of nationalism was substantiated by the creation of liberal democratic institutions and ideology in the post-independent era. There have been traditions of religious tolerance and examples of coexistence of religions, cultures, languages, and ethnic groups, but at the same time, the question of identity, majority-minority conflicts have played a disintegrative role and encouraged subnationalist tendencies as well. India alone has succeeded in promoting a broad-based nationalism. Sri Lanka has to shift to narrow-based religio-cultural nationalism. Pakistan emerged on the basis of distinct religious identity, which too failed in securing the integrity of country. Bangladesh emerged on the basis of its distinct linguistic identity, where its rulers tried to move broad-based secular identity but failed soon. Bhutan and Nepal still largely dependent on traditional political institutions. Let's have a look at the question of nationalism in some of the post-colonial nation states in South Asia. Nationalism in India. In India, nationalism has been conceptualized in various ways, such as ancient civilizational entity, as representation of composite culture, a unit of political and territorial entity. Without going into details of these explanations, it can be said that in India, nationalism as a political ideology represents the liberal, democratic and secular outlook promoting the notion of unity in diversity. After independence from the British rule, the nationalism in India continued to be shaped by political thought that prevailed in the course of Indian national movement and draws inspiration from the great historical traditions, the ideology of leaders of nationalist movement, the constitution, democratic political institutions and processes. The liberal and secular nationalism was maintained so long as these structures and processes worked well. However, the erosion of democratic institutions, political hegemonies, rise of fundamentalism, politicization of ethnic caste, linguistic and religious groups, and the failure of modernization gave rise to regionalism. These distortions also gave rise to social movements, regionalism and sub-nationalist movements. However, the Indian nation has remained intact because the core institutions and values shaping the liberal secular nationalism are still intact despite many attacks and challenges. Nationalism in Pakistan. Pakistan emerged as an independent state with partition of India in 1947 on the plea that Muslims constituted a distinct identity. Hence, religion became the basis of Pakistani nationalism. The Islamic symbols and ethos became the basis of the state of Pakistan. The Pakistan state failed in broadening the basis of nationalism due to decline of democratic institutions and rise of military dictatorships. The religion proved to be insufficient to maintain the identity of Pakistani state, which even led to the breakdown of West and East Pakistan. The sectorial divide between Sunni majority and Shia minority too became prominent. Apart from this, ethno-regional identities also began to surface in Pakistan and they claimed to be separate nationalities. Nationalism in Bangladesh. The distinct linguistic identity provided input to the independence of eastern wing of Pakistan as an independent state of Bangladesh. After its emergence as an independent state, Bangladesh followed a liberal democratic model and paved way for the growth of secular nationalism in the country. But it was not very late that the secular nationalism of Bangladesh lost its track. In 1975, after the military takeover of politics, the country began to promote religious nationalism. The principle of secularism was dropped. In 1990s, Bangladesh again moved to democratic political order. Nevertheless, the Islamic slogans and symbols remained present in the politics of Bangladesh. Some believe that it is the military bureaucratic elite and the fundamentalist forces that use them as an instrument of political mobilization. And hence, the atmosphere in the favor of secular nationalism was not encouraged. The different sets of ruling elites of Bangladesh have chosen different sources of nationalism. It's due to this reason that with the change of regimes, the contours of nationalism have also changed in Bangladesh. Nationalism in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, like India, nationalism took roots as a struggle against the colonial rule. The Western educated elite represented it. It became as a composite nationalism. However, the ground realities of politics in the country proved to be different. It was not very late that the democratic governance of Sri Lanka began to pick up the religio-cultural symbols of majority Sinhalese. It gave rise to religio-cultural nationalism in Sri Lanka, which was essentially the Sinhala nationalism. The other communities, particularly the Tamils, were alienated. The Sinhala dominated the ruling elite, ignored the demands of Tamils. It ultimately gave rise to Tamil separatism, and Tamil subnationalism has thus proved a major challenge to Sri Lanka for many years. Nationalism in Nepal. Nepal escaped the colonial occupation, and therefore the role of traditional symbols has been less complicated in shaping the nationalism. The founders of the Kingdom of Nepal promoted religious identity of the state, which gave rise to Hindu nationalism. Attempts were made to integrate various non-Hindu communities through a process of Hinduization. The promotion of Hindu nationalism also gave legitimacy and substance to the institution of monarchy. Hence, there was a convergence of interests between monarchy and the propagation of Hindu nation. However, it's believed that religion has not been a source of tension or conflicts in Nepal, nor for political mobilization. Nationalism in Bhutan. In Bhutan, Drukpa culture and the institution of monarchy have been main source of nationalism. The monarchy represents the Drukpa culture, and Bhutan's national identity has been closely related to Drukpa culture. Thus, there is a close interlinkage between Bhutanese national identity, monarchy, and Drukpa culture. The Bhutanese ruling elite has promoted this interlinkage. The ruling elite of the country has allowed modernization and development only to the extent that it does not disturb existing interlinkages. As Bhutan feared a threat to its cultural identity from the Nepalese migrants, it imposed a cultural code on the Nepalese, which was basically a Drukpa culture code. It gave rise to conflict with the Nepali migrants in the country. At the end, one has to be cautious of the dangers of the aggressive tilt, which the popular outlook on the nation and nationalism have occurred in many nation states of South Asia. If this trend continues, concept of nation and nationalism in South Asia will be soon stripped of its humanity and accommodative character, thereby generating jingoism. This danger was something which had alarmed Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore way back in 20th century. In fact, there is a thin line which differentiates between love for a nation and jingoism. While love for a nation generates compassion, jingoism generates hatred. This hatred can be for other national communities or for specific communities residing within the same nation. Moreover, the judgmental attitude based on public performance of nationalism would only lead towards an unusual situation where people will be forced to abide by the love for a nation just like any other law and would not necessarily feel it from within. There is a need to restrict South Asian states from turning into geographical demons under the influence of so-called torch-bearers of nation, devouring its own age-long citizens and forcing them to abide by a specific brand of nationalism. Here, it's significant to contemplate the ideas of Gandhi and Tagore on this very subject, as no one in South Asia can be representative of true nationalism than these two personalities. Dear students, I hope that you have enjoyed the lecture on nation and nationalism in South Asia. Thank you.